This is the Fatty Joe Show, coming to you from Casa de Carrie, deep in the forests of Nutmeggerville. This show is dedicated to exploring pathways to better health from a holistic perspective. In each episode, we will explore such topics as nutrition, mental and emotional health, fitness, and more. I'm Yogi, your host, and I became interested in studying health after conventional health dogma became damaging and led me to become massively overweight. Against modern convention, I went on a keto lifestyle and I lost over 300 pounds and gained a level of control on my personal health that I never had before. Now I'm on a journey to find out what is myth and what is truth in the ever-convoluted world of what is considered healthy. Come join me on a journey of discovery as I look for a path to improve total health. If you'd like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/thefattyjoeshow or patreon.com/carriebrown. If you want to check out all of our social media links and recipes, head to carriebrown.com. Don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe to the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Fatty Joe Show, coming to you from the Nutmegger Forest at Casa de Carrie Land. Today, as I said in the previous podcast, I am really grateful and blessed to be able to be in a position now where I get to talk to people that help shape my nutritional foundation to help me lose a lot of my weight. And today is another one of those people he's just an awesome human being. I got to meet him at the Keto Salt Lake conference as well as Keto Fest. We had some great conversations there. And I just have been following his work since I found out about him since I was on the truck. And his research into cholesterol, his research into how lipids work in the body, how fat cells work, what they do has just been fascinating. And he's really turned me on to researching myself a lot more into science and trying to be more scientifically minded. And I want to welcome Dave Feldman to the show. Dave, thank you for being on.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
Dude, it's really is an honor, man. And I like to start the show off with everyone talking about their superhero origin story, how they came about. And I'd like to, for you, I would love to hear about what got you into engineering, first of all, and then what got you onto looking at nutrition, not just the ketogenic diet, but just all the research that you've been doing in nutrition that you've focused on, even now with your work with Chris Bear and the other programs that you have going on.
Yeah, well, the two are kind of discretely separate from each other. I started really having kind of an engineer mindset back in grade school. There were lots of indicators. For example, I loved to take things apart. I loved to play with Legos and build things. My dad one time was a beaming, proud father because I built a transmission out of Legos, which I didn't think was that big of a deal. But I did need to understand how a transmission worked because I was trying to figure out how it was that you really could just this lever around and then end up with a different arrangement underneath between the gears. And so that was kind of exciting to me. But I especially loved something known as abstract mechanics. I liked imagining these larger holistic systems. And that really is what kind of led me into software, because you can really do that rapidly when it comes to writing code. And so I think I started writing code, like maybe age 11 or 12. And really just continued ever since. There were lots of other things I would be interested in that I thought I might go into. Politics at one time, possibly litigation. I thought maybe I might be a lawyer. Filmmaking, for example. And ironically, all of these things would later serve me in life because eventually I'd be an entrepreneur and would start a lot of businesses, including the last business that I was a partner in that gave me the nest egg for what this next chapter in my life was, which, get this, actually started exactly 5 years ago, 4 days from now. So
Wow.
on November 24th, it will have been 5 years to the day that I got a particular piece of paper that would change my life forever. And on that paper was my cholesterol numbers after 7 months of being on a ketogenic diet. And really, since then, it's about the least amount of code I've written in my life because my life just changed directions. I became obsessed with why. Why was my cholesterol high on a low carb diet? What I had already learned didn't make sense, which is that actually it's not the amount of cholesterol you eat, because most of that is in a form called cholesterol esters, and that mostly goes through your body. But I did find that if you're consuming a lot of fat, particularly saturated fat, that does tend to have an association with higher cholesterol. But it wasn't as clear that that's what would cause heart disease directly. Yet there was an association with cholesterol and heart disease. The catch is that you had to look at it in a broad context. So without looking at HDL and triglycerides, which we'll get into in a moment. But that so-called bad LDL, that was really high to me 5 years ago. I became obsessed with this system that moved it around in your body and started doing experiments. I started doing experiments where I would eat to different food plans to see, after taking a blood draw afterward, what would happen. And more I realized that really, and I posit to this day, it really is indeed a network. And that's the benefit of having been a software engineer up until this point, is I could see a lot of the things in common with that system that moves cholesterol around in our body and a network. And I would argue to this day that it's primarily an energy distribution network. The reason cholesterol can go up higher for someone like me is because I believe my body is trafficking more fatty acids around in the same boats that also carry that cholesterol.
That's fascinating. And it seems that it's the people from Silicon Valley, the engineers, specifically the computer engineers, but also, guys like Ivor Cummins, who's a bio, what was it? I forgot what kind of engineer he is, but he's a
Biochemical engineering.
biochemical engineer. The You guys are on the forefront of the scientific research that is going away from the typical dogmatic approach. And part of me knows that a lot of our dogma has come from the lobbying industry and things like that, but I also think a lot of it has to do with the lack of understanding we had of systems because of the lack of diagnostic tools that I mean, Ansel Keys was making the heart health hypothesis back in the 1930s, 1940s. The diagnostic tools that we have now is so far much more advanced. But yet, when people are coming with these new findings, they're getting a lot of pushback because people are still holding to the 1930s theories that are now being disproven. How do we get more people to understand, one, the diagnostic tools have changed, and two, get them thinking more about systems and more about holistic uh, um, approaches to solving problems like engineers do?
Well, that's a great question because before I started this journey, I thought that's what was happening. I thought that, particularly in the field of lipidology, that the reason that the opinion was holding tight was because evidence kept securing it. That as more and more evidence was coming in, it was clear that indeed cholesterol was just like cigarette smoke, which give it any context, whether or not you're sitting at home as a couch potato or whether you're running and you're keeping healthy and your diet is fantastic and maintained well, doesn't matter. Smoking versus non-smoking, same cohorts, with the only difference being smoking, you're going to have more cardiovascular disease, you're going to have more all-cause mortality. But that was one of the first things I looked into in 2015, in November, 5 years ago. So I went, okay, well, it's pretty simple. If I see that higher LDL means you just die sooner, full stop, then that's all I really need, because then it fits with smoking. But pretty quickly I found that no, actually, this didn't make any sense at all, given the hypothesis. But people at middle age or later were not dying sooner. And like right then, that's the gut check before even coming into looking at things systemically. So it's not like I would just want to unpack something for which there already was a lot of research for. But how it's presented to you and I is as something simple. We're usually seeing a graph, right, that shows an axis on one side of exposure and an axis on another side of disease, or vice versa. And you see that the more exposure you have, the more disease you have. And I've seen that graph a zillion different ways when it comes to cholesterol and heart disease. And that to me seemed odd, because like with smoking, it's not just that it brings up your chance of like lung cancer and cardiovascular disease, but that it's with no trade-off. Therefore, your all-cause mortality, as they would call in the literature, should be going up. So for me, that goes, well, now wait a sec. There's more to investigate here that we need to figure out. And that leads me to want to take an engineering approach. And I thought that that's how medicine worked. I thought that, well, of course, they're wanting to get to the physiology of it and how all these things come together. But in the area of lipidology, I will say that there does seem to be a strong adherence to the lipid hypothesis in particular. And this is with me acknowledging that it's possible that they're right. But why wouldn't we want to investigate, at a minimum, investigate healthy people with high LDL, just to confirm the hypothesis? Why lump together all of these other cardiometabolic risk factors into a population that also has high LDL? And that's why, I can't miss the opportunity, because this kind of segues me into it. That's why we're doing a study. We're doing a study on what we call lean mass hyperresponders. A hyperresponder is somebody who goes on a low carb diet, they see their cholesterol go way up. Tends to be typically people who are leaner and more metabolically flexible, generally, not always. But lean mass hyperresponders, they tend to have super, super, super high levels of LDL, but also very high HDL, cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, and very low triglycerides, which is a measure of fat in the blood. And that to me is very relevant, because it gets back to this larger hypothesis I have. But we're going to measure these lean mass hyperresponders directly with CTAs. And the CTA is like basically a scan of your cardiovascular system. It's very advanced. And we'll see if high levels of LDL translate to higher levels of plaque in the arteries for these lean mass hyperresponders.
Now, this is something that we talked a bit off air, and we're finding that people, not only are they holding to these dogmatic ideas, but they're also becoming angry when these ideas are explored. They're becoming, if you're asking questions, they don't like that. What do you think is the reasoning behind the fact that people don't want to explore and ask these questions and actually apply scientific method to the science?
Well, I have to be diplomatic here, but the whole concept behind accountability is feeling you are held to account. If I can state something and feel confident that you can't challenge my statement, it might, on an unconscious level, it might make me feel a little more inclined to state all kinds of things that I don't feel I have to get checked on. And that was one of the things we were talking about off air. I feel that's a difference in culture. In engineering, particularly software engineering, I don't care whether you're a senior software engineer or a junior, oftentimes every voice is going to come at you critically if you're taking an approach that can be proven wrong. And because of that, we're always self-checking. We always have a little bit of a critic built into us, so that we don't present to a whole room of other engineers something that could be demonstrably proven false. And or for that matter, if it can't easily be proven true in the context that we're looking for, that can be its own criticism. And I don't know that we have that same kind of apportioned accountability in some fields of science. And I feel like lipidology is kind of one of those. I don't feel like it's very easy to challenge the existing prevalent view. And you know, we're looking to see what we can do as far as both putting forward things in the literature and also doing this study. But that's also why I think the study, that's why I think all roads lead to the study. There shouldn't, if we can't get them to look at the data, we need to then conduct our own clinical trial to acquire it ourselves and let the data speak for itself. Because as of right now, I don't know that anything would quite get their attention like living, breathing, walking around people with super, super high levels of LDL who we do not observe high levels of atherosclerosis. Now, again, I say that with the caveat that that may be what we do find. It could be that I'm Ansel Keys' best friend. It could be that I prove with lean mass hyperresponders that they're all in terrible shape, and in which case, for sure, we'd want to act on that information. But conversely, if it turns out that they do not have the same rapid atherosclerosis we would expect with likewise levels of FH, FH being familial hypercholesterolemia, then, well, we have to take a different look. We have to take a new look because that data will be very compelling.
Yeah. And right now, it seems like even in the keto world or low carb or vegetarian, there's a lot of contradictory views on whether or not cholesterol is actually dangerous for you. You'll hear some group people say, yes, absolutely, it's dangerous. Other people say it's nothing to worry about. Some people say it's only dangerous if there's other conditions, outlying conditions like chronic stress or something like that. But the more and more I've been reading, it seems to be more and more of a confusing field. So there's really a lot of, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to be a lot of theory without the evidence, which seems to be, where this study is going to apply more evidence to find out the truth.
Yes. Let me give you a good example of that. I mentioned to you earlier that you can look at middle-aged to older populations and surprisingly, or at least surprisingly in light of the hypothesis, generally higher LDL associates with greater longevity, not the other way around. So typically speaking, and I found this out just looking at the raw data of NHANES, which is from the CDC, the oldest living populations, those in like the 90s, 100s, et cetera, that had gotten a blood test 10, 15 years earlier from the NHANES data set, it was more likely that they would be recorded as alive, the higher their LDL was. And again, that would seem surprising in light of this. But what the usual response is, oh, this must be reverse causality. It could be that when other people with lower LDL got their blood taken at that time, a large fraction of them were already suffering from some disease that both resulted in lower LDL and would ultimately kill them. And I think that that's a fair hypothesis to put forward, but I think you can't just say that and then that's the answer to the question. You have to still prove that hypothesis. You have to say, oh, okay, and we know this because we actually, fill in the blank. We checked for this disease, that disease, et cetera. Because what I have done also with the same NHANES data set is I looked at these same populations and then I eliminated everybody who died within, X number of years, like within 3 years or 5 years, so that if they were really close to death, they wouldn't have been counted in the first place. We disappear that. And then on top of that, I would do, say, removing those people who have reported any medical condition, removed people who had high fasting insulin. I basically try to intentionally pick the best comparable groups that were as healthy as we could look at. And I still end up getting the same answer generally, is that the higher total in LDL cholesterol tends to associate with lower all-cause mortality. So epidemiology, I can never state this enough. Epidemiology is not good at proving causation. So I wouldn't want anyone to go off of that. But it is good at knocking down claims of causation. So if I'm telling you, hey, smoking 3 packs a day will make you live longer, and you go, oh, do we have any studies on that? And let's say that we didn't. You go, okay, but I'm just going to go ahead and look at the NHANES data. Actually, Dave, it looks as if the big smokers don't live as long. Can you explain this? I can't go, it's probably reverse causality, but it's up to you to prove me wrong. No, no, no. That does go directly against this claim that I'm making. And in that sense, it helps to help knock down that claim of causation.
This is I've been seeing a lot of people also saying that the relationship of cholesterol as far as a health aspect goes is different between genders as well. That some of these studies that they've done, they've classified, because men showed up that they were having more heart disease with higher LDL, that it must be true for women too. But as people look deeper, it seemed like women stayed healthier with higher LDL and numbers, rather than applying the same kind of logic toward men. So where's the problems with the research before when it comes to gender or even racial bias in the research? And is there any way we can improve and mitigate the older results when it comes to looking at different populations like that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because this is actually kind of a pet peeve of mine, in that a lot of the research does seem to focus a bit more, not just on males and not necessarily so much with humans, but certainly in animal models. A lot of rodent models are with male rats, which they'll actually say, and I've read this before, tend to be more successfully induced with atherosclerosis via something like a balloon catheter. So if you injure a male's carotid artery, it's more likely that it'll become atherosclerotic, whereas it's tougher to do that with the female. And that alone already upsets me, because it's kind of like saying, well, we need to find the gender of the animal model that would most successfully emulate this atherosclerotic effect, rather than trying to look closer as to the why. Why is it that males versus female rodents would do that? And even so, why wouldn't you want to do a mix of the two if you're applying the findings to the general population? Which already is kind of problematic when you're jumping from an animal to a human model. But yes, to the point that you just mentioned earlier, the data looks even better for females than it does for males. Some of the studies that I can point to that look at all-cause mortality, they'll have a little more like a U-shaped curve when it comes to males, where it's definitely the worst for all-cause mortality in association, if you will, for very low LDL. But there's kind of a midpoint, to like a moderate midpoint, to where it seems to be the lowest all-cause mortality, and then it slightly turns up on the right side as LDL gets a little bit higher for men. For women, it's almost always a crisscross. It's almost always the higher your LDL or total cholesterol for sure, the lower your all-cause mortality. And for women, there's even more of an association with the longevity comparing the two. Now, that said, I will say, as I've done with the NHANES data, you start playing with the numbers of metabolic health, and that kind of changes. I think that, and this kind of gets back to something else. I think there may be a reverse causality that's going in the other direction, in that things you do that can destroy your metabolic health, especially, can have a downstream result of higher LDL for the bad reasons. And this is why I care so much about looking not just at one single lipid marker, such as LDL or total cholesterol, but looking at them in combination. And that includes HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, and triglycerides, the measure of fat in your blood. You probably heard me say this before. I like what's known as the triad. I like to see all three of them together: LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. But I'm especially interested, whatever diet you're on, I'm especially interested in whether or not you have high HDL and low triglycerides, which is much more associated with better health overall. to also get back to your original question with regard to ethnicity, there is definitely some interesting differences in the lipid panels with, for example, African Americans. And the triad doesn't apply as effectively because they tend to have lower triglycerides, yet still be at a higher risk when compared to, say, Caucasians, for example. And that is something to keep in mind. But that said, I've also been doing some substratifying with that as well and enhance, which I'll have to get to later because it's still a bit preliminary.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like, where necessarily your people evolved, on the racial side of things, where your people evolved at for thousands of years, whether it's in equatorial regions or south or north of the equatorial regions, can really change your biology in what kind of food you can tolerate and how your body responds to lipids and things like that. I've seen that certain things will increase the likelihood of cancer and heart disease and things like that with groups of people that were equatorial, where it didn't seem to affect people as greatly that were north or south into the colder climates. And I'm wondering if that has to do with the fact that their body got adapted to putting on more fat to get them through wintertime, through for insulation, and as well as food stores. Like your fat cells are basically the doomsday prepper for the season. That's what it's doing, is trying to keep you to have enough energy when there's going to be famine. So I'm wondering if that the people that evolved in the northern or southern areas in the colder climates actually got more adapted to having more lipids in their system and more fat in their system.
I would say that it's a little bit more, I believe, in the necessity of fat-based trafficking. So let me kind of come at it from this perspective. Your body, and this again is part of the larger lipid energy model, that's my hypothesis, but there does seem to be a lot of data that supports this. Generally speaking, you can kind of think of a ketogenic diet as a low glycogen diet, more specifically your liver glycogen. So glycogen is the storage form of glucose. And your liver is kind of like your metabolic brain. It's really watching the trains coming in and out as far as energy goes. And here's actually an analogy I like to use that I think a lot of people can get. Basically, what's happening is your body is running a buffet with your bloodstream. The buffet is meant to provide all nutrients that your cells may need on demand, particularly fuel. And if you're going to be running low on glucose, then it needs to pull out something else to replace it, which is fine. It's got that covered. It's going to be fat. And so generally speaking, it makes sure that there's enough fatty acids that are available. Well, if you're on a very low carb diet, that means that you will need to be tapping into your adipocytes more, and they'll need to be active participants in releasing more of that fat into the bloodstream. And that's at one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is your liver, which is taking up some of those fats, putting them into these boats that I keep talking about, the lipoproteins, and also redistributing that back to the fat cells. But in the process of doing this, the cells benefit because the cells in need can then either take of those free fatty acids coming from your adipocytes, or they can take it from the lipoproteins that are coming out of the liver. And that way, you're not as reliant on the glucose that you have less of when you're on a lower carb diet. So if I were to see higher levels of cholesterol, but again, in combination with higher HDL and lower triglycerides in a free living population, I would assume that they just generally have lower glycogen stores in their liver overall. Does that make sense so
Yeah.
far?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's to get to your point, if your native cuisines for whatever place in the world you're at for generations have been more predominantly carbohydrate centric, let's say you're getting lots of tubers or roots, all kinds of things like that, then my expectation is that, yeah, ancestrally, epigenetics, everything else factored in, you have lots of practice. Your lineage has lots of practice with this composition of a diet, and it's going to try to get more and more efficient, understandably, with making use of it to hopefully take you through the journey of life. Conversely, if you're elsewhere and you're having, less carbs as part of the cuisine, then there may be more reliance on fat. And the more that there is reliance on fat and less on carbohydrates, the more that can have a downstream impact on cholesterol. One important footnote to all of this: we're still talking about cholesterol at ride shares on liver proteins in an otherwise metabolically healthy individual. The issue and the reason why cholesterol can get so complicated is that's one context. There are other contexts, including illnesses, either metabolic inflexibility, infection, all kinds of things that can have further effects on your cholesterol levels and aren't even necessarily mutually exclusive to the metabolic side of the ledger. And that's very relevant, because a lot of times what people will ask us is, hey, my cholesterol is at X level. I eat Y diet. Why is that? And the answer to that is we can't answer quickly, because we need to forensically go into all of the different parts of the equation to know for sure. But how much where you're born, your ethnicity, all of that plays into that part of it, the genetics itself, I think it's definitely a sizable component. But with that said, these lean mass hyperresponders I was just talking about, they span all ethnicities that we're aware of. They span all ages that we're aware of. They span both genders. I'll bet you right now I could go, I make this challenge all the time. I'll bet I could go to the gym down the road, grab a bunch of cyclists and runners and so forth, and take them to Dave Island, where I feed them a carnivore diet. And there's no PUFAs and there's no fiber, but they have to eat what I give them. And I'll bet you I could turn most of them into the lean mass hyperresponders.
Mm. So despite the biodiversity, there's still some commonalities in the biological response to the intake of certain foods.
That's my hypothesis. And thus far, that's what seems to keep playing out in the data that we see. In fact, there's many times where somebody tells me they're going to be going on a ketogenic diet, and I go with them through the foods that they anticipate that they're going to eat, bearing in mind some things will throw off that equation. For example, if you do have a lot of PUFAs in your diet, polyunsaturated fatty acids, that can bring down LDL for reasons we won't get into right now, but I can just say there's lots of ways in which that can bring down LDL that may or may not be good, but that can help to further explain it. And same thing if you've got a lot of fiber, if you're having a lot of leafy greens or things along those lines, that can also impact your cholesterol levels. But if somebody tells me they're going to go on a carnivore diet and they're going to just be carnivore, and they already started in a state of being metabolically healthy and they're already lean, I tell them, just so you know, be prepared. You will probably exhibit the profile of a lean mass hyperresponder. And the vast majority of times thus far, I've been right about that.
I've been seeing a lot of people saying too that they're not as concerned about the LDL or the HDL particles. HDL is commonly associated with the good cholesterol, LDL bad cholesterol, but it's really, from what I've seen, not necessarily one's bad or the other. It's more balances. But the thing that seems to be the red flag to more and more people is the triglyceride levels in relation to more so than the cholesterol levels. And I heard you talking at Keto Salt Lake at the little after party at the Bears, where you were doing some tests on people and seeing that coffee was skyrocketing many people's triglycerides. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And I think our listeners would as well.
Yes. So first and foremost, I feel like I always have to put this in there because people get very passionate about their coffee. This is a fraction of the total. Yeah. It's interesting. I was just talking to, I can't say who it is, but I was talking to a very, very, very high-list A-lister who had wanted my help on something this week and was considering doing the Feldman protocol, which is where you're just consuming a lot of fat in the 3 days coming up to the blood test. And this was for insurance. They wanted to bring down their insurance. And they said that they read the post, but one of the things that I mentioned would be helpful is if they could drop the coffee. They said that's not going to happen. Like almost as if I had asked them to stop believing in God or something for, a few days. But that's not too far off from how some people treat coffee. Like even there's a few family members I've said just for one morning, at least for the fasted blood test, don't have coffee. They go, I just can't imagine getting up in the morning without the coffee. And I'm like, just have it after the blood test. Get the blood test first and then have the coffee. But there's so many people I know for which it's hard for me not to characterize it as an addiction, because if you really are incapable of not consuming it, even for just like a short span of time for something of this nature. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Let me get back to the original point, which is
no worries.
There is a fraction of people who, especially if they're on a very low carb diet, let's say carnivore, they will observe high levels of triglycerides even if they're 12 to 14 hours fasted. So if somebody comes to us right now, they go, hey, I've got high triglycerides, what's going on? Our number one suspect, and this usually is the case, is that they're not 12 hours fasted, that when they got their blood test, they were maybe 8 hours fasted, or worse is if it was like 2 or 3 hours fasted because they went to the doctor's office and the doctor's office goes, oh, no, you don't need to get a fasted blood test. Just go ahead and we'll take it right now. And if you're a low carber, you should be aware you quite literally installed triglycerides into your bloodstream in a meal. Like literally, that's where they came from in the lipoproteins known as chylomicrons. So yes, we strongly recommend that you be fasted at least 12 to 14 hours, water only. Ideally, you don't have coffee. But for those people who do seem to see persistently high levels of triglycerides, we recommend that they consider, if they're fully fasted, so this is the second suspect, trying to get off of coffee for at least a week, for like 7 days, and then retest. And some people receive that well. A lot of people do not receive that well. It's like we're asking them to, I would use metaphors, but they're all bad metaphors. I'll just say it's like a strong thing. But for some people, that's exactly what it is. It's this coffee sensitivity that we've noticed, where they have high triglycerides that seem to be specifically linked to coffee, not to caffeine, because that's what we all assumed, is that it was caffeine, but to coffee in particular. We actually know many people who have diet sodas or diet energy drinks that definitely have lots of caffeine, and they don't seem to observe the same phenomenon.
Now, is this true whether it's caffeinated or decaffeinated coffee?
Yep. That's thus far one of the most extensive tests somebody's done. It's up on our site. If somebody listening to this goes to cholesterolcode.com and searches coffee, there's somebody who did, I want to say 7 or 8 blood tests and tried different types, tried caffeinated and decaffeinated, tried going 2 in a row without having coffee, 2 in a row with having coffee, has some very compelling data that shows, for him at least, it definitely was the coffee in particular.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely know and I'm just going to straight out say addiction to coffee and the caffeine, because we're finding that it may not be the actual substance that you're addicted to, but whatever reward centers of the brains that substance activates, you're addicted to that result in your body. And if it's coffee, if it's sweets, if it's gambling, if it's, so the addiction can go more than that. And coffee, like food addiction, it's a food. And I know for a fact with me, there's times where I've done fasts off the coffee and had withdrawal type symptoms, the headaches, the lethargy, everything that you would, even like stomach issues and things like that you would associate with withdrawal. So caffeine is a drug. It's in coffee, and maybe the reward centers that are activated and the enzymes and hormones that are released, you get addicted to those as well.
Yeah, and tough. It's tough talking to people about this topic, but I've had many of these discussions with family and friends where I say, look, no matter who you are, everything you consume, it ultimately is habit based. You didn't come out of the womb with a predilection towards the particular things that you're now going to eat. You were raised into it to some degree. You discovered some of these foods, but they're routines. And it's hard to do this, but I say trust a little bit in the momentum that can build in making a change. And it may hold, it may not hold, but I would apply this with any food addiction or any substance addiction is, you may need to take more steps beyond simply trying to get the momentum going. You may need to be sure it gets out of the house. You may need to actually physically move somewhere else. You may need to get certain people out of your lives. But that said, I will say this is kind of not just building off coffee, but off of food addiction itself. I will say I now have such a profound respect for how much what we consume impacts our health and really even our behavior and our outlook in life. I've seen it with my own experiments, how much discreetly changing something without there being a likewise catalyst can affect how I think of things. That it can raise anxiety, for example, that it can put me in dark moods, and all that I can then resolve by coming to the end of the experiment. That kind of stuff really is eye opening. But it makes me appreciate just how much this is probably overlooked by most people.
And on the same lines, you did an experiment. I believe it was with cherry Coke, Diet Cherry Coke, or was it Coke?
Um,
Where you were, I thought I heard you talking about this at Keto Salt Lake as well, where you were talking about you had a habitual was it cherry Coke, or it was some sort of Diet Coke thing that you were really looking forward to it, and you decided to go off the Coca-Cola product for a while and get away from it to see.
right, right.
So
Yeah, I talked with Carrie about that. Is I for a year and a half I was water only, and mainly to try to kick having a lot of diet sodas. And when I was traveling earlier this year, we were going around the world. I ended up trying to mitigate because I wanted to have something that was sweet. My ability to find keto friendly versions of sweet became very impossible. So I decided to make a compromise with myself to allow for diet sodas. That became a thing again. And so I then had to mitigate it. In fact, one of the things I'm drinking right now is an electrolyte drink, but it's very, like, it's basically no sugar, but it's a sweetened drink. And what you were talking about, it took an experiment that I was already doing long term for me to not have soda as part of the protocol for the experiment, for me to be able to kick in quitting it. And that was part of what I talked to Carrie about. I do think I do think this is one of the neat things about experiments in general. A lot of times you don't do it because you're certain you're going to have this lifestyle change. A lot of times you're just saying, hey, can I even just do this for a period of time? Can I just quit something, for 3 weeks, 4 weeks? And hey, while I'm doing that, why don't I go ahead and get a blood test at the end of it? See how much different my blood work is or isn't. That I encourage. A lot of times it's either taking something on that's new that you might think is a good health change, but a lot of times it may be trying to get something out that you might think is bad and helping to confirm that. I think coffee can be one of those examples. If you find that you may have some issues, because we have had some people who quit coffee just for the triglyceride test, and it turned out that there were some other issues that they had with coffee they didn't realize until they fully quit it for 7 days. And think about that. It's just like 7 days, only 7 days that changed the outcome of how they looked at that from then on.
yeah, it's amazing how our body responds to certain things and how different people can respond to it in different ways. And one of the things I've seen for myself is I seem to respond to coffee differently when I'm under stress than when I'm not stressed out. And if I'm getting good sleep, if I'm getting everything's cool, I have my coffee. I don't have the anxiety levels that I'll get. I don't have the desire to continue coffee. But when I'm stressed out, I drink a lot of coffee, but I'll get jittery, and it seems to affect me in a different way based on what's happening, external circumstances that are happening outside. So I know, like, there's a lot of variations that can come into play when you're trying to cut things off and you get different results. And I also noticed that when I cut the coffee off when I am stressed, it helps me get back to a more less stress state. So,
Do you find you consume more coffee when you're stressed?
oh yeah, oh yeah, because I
Yeah.
I, I think when I'm stressed, my sleep suffers. So in my mind, it's like I need coffee to get going, and
It's a vicious cycle.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it gets into this cycle. So and then I'll realize I'm drinking too much coffee, and I'll try to titrate it down and then cut it off completely for a few days. So every once in a while, I'll go 3 or 4 days without it, and I find alternatives with teas and things like that that I'll do. Or Carrie introduced me to doing this dandelion chicory root combination that you brew up in a French press like coffee, and I even added to that where I've been actually adding cocoa nibs to give it a more of a chocolatey flavor.
Hmm.
And that's it. It tastes a lot like coffee. It scratches that coffee itch flavor wise, because coffee is a flavor I do enjoy, but it doesn't have the same response in my body that coffee does. And
Right.
even teas and stuff like that that have caffeine in there create a different response in my body than coffee does, as far as like jitteriness and things go. Things that I can measure, that I can see without having diagnostic tools at my fingertips.
Well, it's a lot of caffeine. I mean, coffee is a lot of caffeine per
Yeah.
ounce relative to other things. I do get fascinated. There's almost a parallel version of me that, as much as I like my experiments, I sometimes really obsess about these habits and these reward effects that I feel, and how much my exhaustion levels, stress levels, etc., play into overindulging on those things that give me joy, because it is effectively the acceptable drug in our lives. It's I'm sure we'll see a lot of, try to reduce your calories, blah blah blah. The bottom line is this: as far as wanting to make yourself happy in a chemical way quickly, you can do it with food, and
Mhm.
it's acceptable. You don't have to have heroin at home. You can have a chocolate cake, or you can have ice cream, or you can have pizza, or whatever it is that you take joy from, and then consume it at a level that might be problematic. And that's why, for me, nothing beats proximity. There are some foods I know I just can't have in the house. If I have them in the house, I'll eat them. I'll eat them
Yeah.
without being hungry. And that's the first sign that I need to just not have them in the house, because if they're just not in the house, I won't eat them. And
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, just that's that's the irony. Is the one time in which I'm very good about what I eat is when I'm in an experiment, because it was actually prescribed in the experiment and I have blood work into it. So there's money on the line. I structured my life around it. But I find that outside of experiments, people assume I'm much more disciplined with my diet, but I have the same struggles as I think most people I know. It's just that I've learned from the experiments some things that work better than others. Like, you can't beat proximity. And the other shoe to drop is, unfortunately, social. There's enormous social wiring. You don't want, when you communally want to be in with everybody else. So when they're enjoying something and eating something together, there's a stigma that both you and they apply to you, even if they're trying to be supportive of what diet you're in. The fact that you're not eating the pie that grandma made along with the rest of your family, it has almost an injurious effect. It has almost a traumatic effect. And so both proximity and the social influence alone, both of those two alone, are super hard to overcome, particularly if you're already stuck in an environment where you can't achieve either one of those or achieve a distance from either one of those.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to mob mentality. You know, you get a large group of people, and if part of that group starts doing something that another part of that group knows is ethically wrong or goes against their morals and their standards or is not beneficial, they'll still go along with it because that's what the group is doing. That's, you know, and it's the same when it comes to food. If the group is eating, you know, the food, and there's even pressure sometimes amongst the groups, like, oh, a little bit won't hurt you, just go for it.
You've
But
been doing great. You should treat yourself.
Right. But you wouldn't say that to somebody who's a heroin addict.
Right.
A
Or
little
an
bit won't
alcoholic.
hurt you, or an alcoholic, you know?
You've been sober 3 years. Yeah, I take the edge off, right?
Yeah. It's the same thing with moderation. You would never tell a heroin addict a little bit's okay in moderation, or an alcoholic,
Right.
you know?
Right.
You know?
What almost makes it that much worse, though, is when you are with a whole bunch of other addicts and they're all kind of agree, you know, sort of mutually agreeing to step off the wagon together. And there's almost a camaraderie that you'd feel especially stigmatizing if you turn this down. And if you push back and said, no, I'm going to be good. You guys do your thing, you know, whatever. It's an individual choice, but I can't.
You know, it seems to me that more and more as I've gotten older, it seems to me that humans are pack animals by nature. We're, you know, we through evolution, we were, you know, if you look at other animal species, we're pretty dang weak. We are very fragile when it comes to a lot of other species out there. So what our strengths was our ability to develop tools and our groups, our tribes that got together, and we find strength in those tribes. We find strength in those groups because whether it's from a predator getting us or another group of people that may threaten what we've established and what we have coming in to take what we have and maybe kill us and go our way. We have this almost genetic, habitual, evolutionary drive to be in groups, to be in tribes, to be in packs. And it's when we are nowadays, our tribes and groups are based on cultural norms and ideas and concepts and political affiliations and dietary affiliations.
Yeah. And you want to know the biggest irony to me is I agree, you know, we won, I think, basically because of our big brains. So we, you know, it wasn't just having opposable thumbs and so forth. It's that we could build all of this, you know, we could engineer this whole society. Here's the irony. The irony is that at the same time, we could engineer a deadly food supply. We could get so comfortable with people far away from us on other continents, making and preparing the food that we'll be consuming every day, and really not caring that much about its true long-term quality outcomes for us and our health. Like that's kind of amazing when you think about it. We're smart enough to build all this, but not so smart that we can push back on our limbic system that gives us these reward center effects. We like that ice cream. We like that pizza. We like those donuts. Those donuts are delicious. We don't have this natural like frontal lobe response that goes, no, man, the donuts, whatever price you think you're paying with those donuts, it's not worth the outcome. It doesn't happen, right?
Well, if you look at evolution, we are also, animals in general tend to seek the easy way out of things, the safe way out of things, and humans are no different. I mean, yes, we have extreme sports and things like that, and adrenaline junkies, but there's a different reward spots. But we're very driven by reward, and when you look at carbohydrates, especially processed and refined carbohydrates, they really activate those reward centers, and they're easy calories. And evolutionary, that's what we saw. We even when we hunted things like mammoths that killed us, what we learned how to do is run the mammoth off of cliffs so it didn't run us over and kill us. It was the easy calories that way. And when it came to hunting and gathering, the easy, real rewarding calories were these honey and, well, honey wasn't that easy, but like berries and things like that we can gather along the way that made us fat, and it gave our body. And so, you know, we have a biological drive to crave these things.
Yeah, although to be fair, I do think that we had a lot of carbs in our history, but they were very fibrous carbs.
Yeah.
If you look at particularly if you compare fruit, I mean, fruit of even just 100 years ago to fruit today, it's not even a close comparison. It was much smaller, it was way more fibrous, and you wouldn't have had Cro-Magnon man collecting 5 big fat juicy oranges and then squeezing that into orange juice and then consuming that, every morning, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't a thing. So no, outside of a tiny percent of the population that was very wealthy or resourced, there was the vast majority of us had a lot of practice with the opposite. We had a lot of practice with famine and starvation and unintended fasting alongside putting in a lot of effort to get the food that we got. And yeah, I do find that I'm not convinced anybody was truly carnivore or truly vegetarian by choice until more recently, like, you know, we're talking since the agriculture era and so forth. But I will say I am convinced, given what I've seen, that we did prize meat, especially that was something that if we could get, we would choose to get. That's why it ends up in the cave drawings and everything else. Is the hunt is an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Well, it's concentrated calories and nutrition that can sustain you much longer than the simple carbohydrates could. Yeah, I didn't really see a lot of cave paintings of people going after eggplant. Like it just
right.
so, but one of those prized animal products in general seem to be very prized, because if you look at history too, the writings often bring honey into it, which is another animal product and things like that, very rich in vitamins and calories and things like that, but very hard to get for old, ancient men. So it was very prized. And but it's those concentrated sources of nutrition that seem to be the big thing that everybody was after. So when there's another research project that you've been involved with that I've been hearing a little bit about, and I don't know if you can elaborate on it, but you've been working with Chris Bear from Ketochow, doing some interesting experiments with Ketochow. So can you give us a rundown on what's going on with that?
Yeah, so Ketochow, I've always kind of liked because it's a meal replacement shake, which makes it easy to do experiments based on what the fat base was. So that was something I postulated I might be doing and was planning to do from the summer. I was going to do an extra virgin olive oil versus butter experiment where for 1 week I would have Ketochow only shakes with the fat being, let me just turn off my notifications. Ketochow shakes with the fat being just extra virgin olive oil for 1 week, and then switch in the next week to everything else being the same: exercise, sleep, and even the amount of Ketochow, but the fat base isocalorically would be changed over to butter. And I was going to go with Carrie Gold butter. And then I was going to do, at the end of that week, at the end of all of these weeks, by the way, I get wide spectrum blood test. But then I was going to flip back to extra virgin olive oil for the 3rd week, and then back again to butter for the 4th week. And I tried doing this experiment twice and failed twice. In that, in the 1st week with the extra virgin olive oil, I felt sick. I just wasn't digesting it well, and I had some issues, which I won't go into. But after basically announcing that I wasn't going to be able to do it, and then I moved on to this other experiment that I did instead, Chris Bear actually came forward and said, "Would you like me to do the experiment for you?" And I was like, yes, that would be great. He has obviously not just a lot more experience with Ketochow, but he seems to tolerate some of these other oils better than I do. So he just did it. He actually completed the extra virgin olive oil versus butter experiment. There's a total of 5 blood tests, one that was at baseline to start, and then one at the end of each of the weeks. And he has that posted right now at ketochow.xyz, I want to say. There's an area where he has the blog or experiments that he's done. And it was great. We got a lot of wide spectrum blood testing out of it.
Nice. And what were you guys discovering with the Ketochow? Well, first of all, what was the theory that you were testing with the Ketochow experiment? And what did you guys find out?
For one, I wanted to know just what difference there was in the lipid profile. It did meet with my expectation, which is, as is typically the advice, if you replace butter with more extra virgin olive oil, you'll probably see lower relative LDL. We did see that. Maybe not as pronounced as I thought it would be, but total and LDL did drop in the EVO arms, the extra virgin olive oil arms, versus the butter. The other thing that I was especially interested in is I wanted to look at an assay called oxidized phospholipid ApoB, or OXPHOS, we'll just call it OXPHOS ApoB. And what that looks is it's looking at the oxidation of the phospholipids that are on, let's say, the hull of these boats of the lipoproteins, particularly ApoB. So ApoB lipoproteins, when they get oxidized, their phospholipids get oxidized. And what this seeks to do is to quantify the total number of those oxidized phospholipids. So understandably, this is closely associated with cardiovascular disease, since oxidation is associated with cardiovascular disease, particularly at high levels, and particularly where you see a lot of oxidative stress. And what I wanted to know is whether we would see higher levels with the EVO arms versus the butter arms. And the short answer is it's somewhat inconclusive. The butter arms were lower. Let me put it this way. The baseline test is where the OXPHOS was the lowest, I think at 1.4. And then I think it rose to, I want to say something like 3.5 or something for the first EVO arm, dropped down to 2 for the butter arm, went back up to 3 for the second EVO arm, and then finally, I thought it might go back down, but instead it went up slightly to 3.2, 3.3, something like that for the butter arm. So it wasn't clearly correlating with either one in a way that I could feel confident we could be sure of. But there is a possible confounder that we're all interested in that we weren't expecting, which is that insulin levels were higher in the butter arms versus the EVO arms. That was a bit surprising to us for a few reasons. One, because I myself have gotten more tests than anybody I know. I have huge amounts of butter. I don't have elevated insulin that I'm aware of yet. In fact, I've had some experiments that were very heavy on the butter and did not see that. Reason number 2 is Chris had already some experimental data where he has had butter and took blood work at the end of it. 2 tests, in fact, for which he was just having butter only. And in those tests, his insulin was the lowest it had been in any of the other tests he had done to date. I want to say one was something like 2.6 and the other 5, something along those lines, but very, very low. Whereas in this test, one was, I want to say 9 and one was 11. And that we're really surprised by. So what we agreed to do is After Thanksgiving, we're gonna him, myself, and his wife are all going to do a mini experiment. It's still 6 days long, but for 3 days, we're going to actually do a different butter. We're going to do Kerrygold. Try to keep everything else the same as what Chris was doing. Take a blood test at the end, and then for the next 3 days, do the butter he was using, which is Kirkland. And for those 3 days, we then follow that with a blood test. So this is what I hypothesize. If there was something specific to that batch of butter that he had, or something that changed about Kirkland, because he had Kirkland in the prior blood tests, then my expectation is the Kerrygold arm would look good, and then the Kirkland test would look bad, as in you'd see the insulin rise. And that would be kind of scandalous if that turned out to be true, because if there really is something to Kirkland butter in particular, then that's a big deal to all of us low carbers. We expect butter to not be higher carb, or at least higher insulinogenic. If, however, if insulin were high for both arms for all three of us, well, then that would be a big deal. That would open up a whole new topic. I'm very doubtful of that, though. At least for myself, I'm very doubtful that I'm going to see higher insulin. But we got to test it, right? Follow the data. And if it's low for all three, then I'm going to be like for both arms. Then I'm going to start thinking that maybe there was something to that specific batch of Kirkland from Chris, which would kind of suck, because then it would mean it contaminated our data somewhat.
Do you think, as far as the theories go, do you think it could be a possibility with a difference of feed of the cattle from Kerrygold to Kirkland? That, there's
possible.
Concentrated. There's a big movement right now for everybody going back to naturally pastured animals, and one of the arguments for the naturally pastured animals is that the feed that the animals are consuming and concentrating into muscle and fat, if it's carrying the toxins, it's going to be concentrating those toxins in the muscle and fat, which is one of the reasons why people go for the wild caught fish rather than the farm raised fish. And so I'm just curious if maybe some sort of toxin was in the feed of the animals that was concentrated down, that related to the insulin response, created a stress response and an insulin response in the body.
Not only do I think that's possible, but I actually operate that way right now. Yesterday, I was in a grocery store because I wanted to get some salmon, because I've just been kind of craving salmon. And they only had farmed salmon. I thought, I'm just not going to bother. I really want to get wild caught salmon. I don't want farmed salmon if I can help it. For the reasons you're talking about, is I'm concerned about how much we've messed with the diet supply of the existing like cattle and livestock especially. But yes, does it potentially have a downstream effect on butter? Yeah, I'm quite concerned about that. I know for sure this has a difference in the composition of the meat itself, and that I think that could be a problem. Certainly, to see the insulinemic effect that we saw with Chris's data, I would consider that a huge problem. That would really concern me a lot. One of the other things to mention that I think is important is throughout this experiment, Chris was wearing a continuous glucose monitor. And to the best of his knowledge, it really wasn't that different between the arms, between the Evo and the butter arms, which makes me dislike even more that possibility that you're describing, that there really could be something that changed in the chemical composition of the Kirkland butter that could result in higher fasting insulin. That's something that would bother me.
One of the things that we found recently, and obviously we haven't tested it, but Carrie was eating. We did a lot of pork belly videos for our YouTube channel, and Carrie, we had gotten pork belly from Costco, Kirkland, and Carrie had a massive negative response to the Kirkland brand pork when compared to the naturally pastured pork that we got from a farmer friend here in Connecticut, from Joan from Walker Farms. And it was to the point where we had to cut off all pork for, Carrie cut off all pork for herself for a while to try and get things out. But she actually initially had a negative reaction to a Max pork rinds when she usually had Epic. When it came to pork cracklings, she usually had Epic. She got a pack of Max pork rinds and had a huge, massive negative reaction to it.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Well, look, got to call a duck a duck. I'm concerned that unfortunately the pandemic may have downstream results on the quality of our food because of course there's going to be a lot of cutting of costs in different places. I'm not saying that that's what's going on, but I'm saying that that's a possibility that's crossed my mind more recently, that this, there are other kinds of forms of inflation, if you will, and sometimes that can impact things like the quality of our food.
Yeah, well, I had an interview recently with Peter Ballerstedt, and we started talking about what's affecting the food supply with the pandemic situation. And me being in the trucking industry, I saw a lot of this behind the scenes, and a lot of it is because especially the larger corporations, but even the smaller ones, they can't adapt to the new way people are shopping for things. A lot of companies were focused on selling their products to either restaurant industry or large corporations, which those aren't buying as much. And so they had to shift, but all their packaging and processing is designed to go there. People were dumping milk because they were used to selling it to uh, schools and things like that, where they sell giant bags of milk, and they didn't have the processing packaging set up to package it in pints or gallons or things to sell to people. So since they couldn't convert, they had to dump a lot, and there was a lot of money lost. And I can imagine people resorting to lower cost production in order to recoup that massive amount of loss that had just occurred with the amount of food that had to be dumped. The other aspect is because of the way people can adapt without having FDA outside of the US, places like Argentina and things like that, we're seeing influx of imported products when it comes to meat and dairy and seafood, which aren't necessarily as regulated, so they can switch over real easy. But we may not be getting the quality products that we're used to getting here in the US. And they, especially when it comes to places like China, where it's notorious toxic ingredients in their food and things like that. We're seeing an issue with that, and the fact that large corporations have even lobbied disclosing where the ingredients came from, or where the come from, or what ingredients are listed in there. Whether or not it's GMO, whether or not it's imported or exported, we're probably going to be seeing, as far as a cost savings aspect, a lot of lower quality raised animals entering the US from outside of the country as well, that could have a number of toxins, and maybe not even just toxins, but maybe a style of feed that was concentrated that the people in that population are used to, but we're not.
Yeah, I think it's a considerable concern. Certainly something I worry about.
Yeah. So what is next? What new, because you're always doing some sort of experiment, and you're always busy with something. So what next do we have being worked out with Dave besides the Ketochow, the future 6-day Ketochow experiment?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously the experiment is the clinical trial we're putting together for the lean mass hyperresponders. As far as what I want to explore next, something that has been on my mind that I've been trying to put together is, while I was going to try to hit extra virgin olive oil discreetly, I now want to hit fiber discreetly. So I may be doing something that's kind of like a double crossover, but for which everything is kept the same. It's isocaloric, but I have psyllium husk in one of the alternating arms versus
Mm.
nothing. With all other food and everything else being the same. The part that I have to play around with is how much of it's going to be soluble versus insoluble. My understanding with psyllium husk is I think it's about about 2/3 soluble to 1/3 soluble, but I think it depends on where you get it and a few other things. But that may not be the most enjoyable experiment. But then again, I have a lot of experiments that aren't that enjoyable. But I do really want to get a solid basis on just how much fiber in particular can impact lipid levels distinctively. It's hard to do that because usually you're having fiber alongside polyunsaturated fatty acids, for example. So this is the purpose of doing experiments like this, is so that you can disentangle the two.
That's going to be cool. I can't wait to see your results on that. I'm also interested in seeing what would happen to the digestive health with the fiber test as well, because like I interviewed Alberto from the Keto Man's Club recently, and he had ulcerative colitis, which resulted in a lot of really bad issues with going to the bathroom and things like that. And fiber is one of his triggers. Like it really does not work well in his system at all. So I'm kind of curious to see where that goes as well. Um, Before we close out, I like to ask all of our guests 5 basically short answer questions, and it's one to give our listeners more research, ideas of what to look up and research, and the other is to see where there's consensus and diversion and different ideas when it comes to nutrition and health. So the first question I like to ask people are what are 3 foods you think everybody should include in their diet? And it can be general. It can be like types of food.
Okay, yeah, because this is obviously very controversial as I try to stay away from the diet debates. I absolutely do believe in the importance of healthy fats, whatever diet you're in, whether it's plant-based or not. I'd hope you get enough healthy fats. And yeah, I do think of saturated fat as being part of that category. It's not like you have to have huge amounts of it, but I do think that it's a good idea to have saturated fats beyond the obvious other healthy fats like omega-3s and so forth. I do think that it's good to have electrolytes baked into your diet, whether you're low carb or not, but especially if you're low carb. I've had to learn that I'm a bit of an outlier in that I need, for example, I try to hit around 10 grams of salt a day. And I literally take salt tablets along with my 2 meals a day. If I have like 2 meals, then for sure I'll have about 3 grams of salt each, in addition to the amount of salt I already add to my food very generously. And last, yeah, water. I mean, it may sound cliche, but try to be sure that you get enough water, that you get enough hydration. I realize that some advice is kind of ridiculous. You should have a gallon a day. I don't know that you need to do that, but I do think a lot of people have health issues associated with just simply not getting enough water and just don't think that it's water. They just don't realize hydration. This, by the way, includes my dad, who drinks almost exclusively coffee, and I have to arm twist him into adding in some water here and there. What do you do? So
Yeah, I drink a lot of water, and I definitely feel the result of when I don't have enough. So we got water, we have saturated fat. You got one more. You got one more in you? Electrolytes, and we got electrolytes. Okay. Now, what are 3 foods you think everybody should avoid?
Oh, now see, that's a lot easier. Generally speaking, I think any food that's high in carbs and fat and low in protein, like that's going to cover a lot of what I was just mentioning earlier. For example, ice cream, donuts. It's very easy to have something that's very energy rich and protein poor, and especially if it's a nice combination of both fat and carbs. Like just don't don't even bother trying new versions of that. It's probably not good. I certainly think things that are deep fried, things that already have a lot of oxidizing to them, you should probably try to avoid. That I think that may not be that good. Now, I don't know. I don't know that I would say you should avoid this entirely, but I will say be mindful of oxalates. I will say that I've now known a number of people who've had severe levels of high oxalates that have been very problematic. And so it's not that I think everybody should just avoid anything that has oxalates, because that's going to be in a whole lot of plant foods, but just try to avoid a lot of it. There's one person I know who's really, I'm not sure how much I can say about their situation, but I can say that they finally figured out it was oxalates, and it was a bit late for them. And they're really working their way back from that. They were having a lot of foods that were very rich on that side of it. So
Yeah, that's I mean, that was the basis of Dr. Gundry's book, the plant paradox, is those oxalates that are having negative effects.
yeah.
The who are your top 5 health heroes? And it doesn't just have to be in nutrition, or it could be, financial health, it could be mental health, it could be nutrition, it could be fitness. Who are 5 people that really inspire you?
Well, I don't want to say top 5. I'll go with 5 that are off the top of my head, because
There you go.
I don't want to rank, because there's so many wonderful people in this space. Certainly, one person that immediately comes to mind is my own colleague Siobhan Huggins. I think she's just a superstar, not just in her smarts, but I also think that her health journey is a really fascinating one, and one that I'll let her, talk with you about or share on other podcasts. I think she's chatted with Carrie before about this. Uh,
I
I
really look forward to having her on too. That she's one of the people that I have on my list.
Yeah, she
So
should be. She's fantastic.
I honestly have a lot of admiration for her. So
Yeah, as it happens, her and I are very connected to Amber O'Hearn, who I'd also bring up. Amber's fantastic. Again, a lot of these people have amazing health information, sometimes have their own backstory that kind of brought them into why they have the obsession that they do and why they research. A lot of times it started with self-interest and expanded out to being more altruistic and helping others. I would say there's, of course, not to be cliche, but I have to bring up Gary Taubs. Gary Taubs has definitely changed a lot of lives of people who I've talked to directly. And I can't mention Gary Taubs and not mention Nina Teicholz, because in a sense, both of them kind of encompass the whole gambit of, and this isn't to say, in listing off these people, this isn't to say that I consider any of them the end all be all, or that I think that they've been right about every single thing and so forth. But do I think that they are heroes in the sense that I've directly talked to people whose lives they've been improved by and would quote these same people? That applies to all 4 of the people I just mentioned so far. And then, it's hard to narrow it down to just one, the last person, but you know what? I'm gonna have to pick on one of my faves, which is Ben Bickman. I really love Ben, and I think he's helped it also bring. He's very good at taking very complex concepts and putting them together in a simple presentation that really gets the idea across. Again, if I had more time, I'd be talking about so many other people, but I'll give you those 5.
yeah, this is really just to give people kind of resources to look into. And I mean, I'm fortunate on this that I'm having all my health heroes come onto the show, and I'm ranking them by discovery of when I'm going after the people that initially started me, and as I discovered new people, those are the ones I'm asking, kind of in that pattern, to come on the show. So that's how I've ranked them, is the ones who initially started me out, and then later on the ones that I discovered along the journey. So,
Right.
what is one health myth that you wish you could just dispose of overnight? Like, just get rid of it.
That you can make lifelong decisions from a single lipid panel. Like, I think that's, for me, that's very long dead. If you read 1% of my work, you'd think, why would one lipid panel become the expectation of your ongoing lipid levels? Like, it's just, I think at a minimum, we've helped to demonstrate, I mean, not just myself, but my colleagues with Siobhan and Craig and all of the people who follow the work and have likewise done versions of the Feldman protocol and so forth. You don't even have to render an opinion on lipid hypothesis, but at a minimum, you have to acknowledge that these levels can be extremely dynamic depending on the context. So yeah, to me, that's just a myth at this point. And I wish that at least that little piece of it would die.
Yeah. And what is something that you would like to change about the medical industry? Something that's really pressing about you, if you could just snap your fingers and alter it.
Well, certainly I would like for it to be more receptive of ideas outside the box. That's all I'll say about that.
That's a good answer. One of the recent ones that I had was Thomas DeLauer was on, and he talked about changing the reward structure of the medical industry to reward cures rather than the treatments in a higher manner. And I thought that was kind of a clever way to go, boiling it down, but it was really interested. But definitely, it does seem like the medical industry is very close-minded in general to a lot of new concepts and ideas. And it kind of reminds me of like Galileo trying to point out, his research on the galaxy, and other scientists going, "Oh no, you're you're totally wrong. We don't believe that." It's almost that same mentality is continuing today. So,
well, the good news is this, and this may be the best thought to leave you with, is I am heartened by how the entire movement, the entire low carb movement, is born out of a rebelliousness towards what was the conventional wisdom of the day, was to be low fat and to be high carb. And we've seen a lot of health benefits in spite of what the expectations of what the predictions would be. And I think that leads me to feel more confident than ever in the concept of citizen scientists being very real and unlocked by the technology of the day of social media and the ability for us to quickly distribute and disseminate information with each other, data with each other. And don't get me wrong, it has its cons as well. But both formal science, formal medical science, and citizen science, for their different pros and cons, I think that they need each other. And I think that there definitely is a need in particular for citizen science more now than ever.
Yeah, I just I don't think if you're following science, you shouldn't be afraid to explore a question. And
100%.
too many people are afraid of exploring that question. So, Dave, before we go, can you tell everybody where to find you, to see your research, to help support your research that is continuing?
Sure. Of course, go to cholesterolcode.com. That's kind of our hub website. It's where you can also find lots of information on our research and also guides and other things that help to kind of put it all together. We also have a public charity in the Citizen Science Foundation. That's our vehicle for helping to raise money to make this lean mass hyperresponder study, which, knock on wood, we're close to launching, hopefully. But there'll be endeavors past that point where we will help to further enhance the concept of citizen science. And actually now somewhat new is Own Your Labs, is our service for helping people actually get labs, and all the proceeds from that go to the Citizen Science Foundation. I'm also very active on Twitter, Dave Keto. So at Dave Keto on Twitter. And that's also one good way to reach me. And lastly, we also have a couple of Facebook groups, one for cholesterol code, one for lean mass hyperresponders. You can just search in Facebook and you'll probably be able to find them pretty easily.
Awesome. And I definitely want to encourage people to get on Dave's site, see the research, and if you can, support, and even sharing what's going on your Facebook or your Twitter or whatever social media site you're on, to bring awareness. And if you don't have the financial resources to support, maybe your share will put that information in front of somebody who does. So go on to Dave's sites, go and share the research, share about the nonprofits that are going on, and help bring more funding into this so that we get answers instead of just theories, and we find out what's really truth and what really isn't. So everybody, I want to thank you so much for listening to the Fatty Joe Show or watching on YouTube. And I want to encourage you, if you want to support this show, go to patreon.com/The Fatty Joe Show or patreon.com/Carrie Brown, and you can support the work that we're doing. Also, if you want a little bit of swag, you can check out our Zazzle shop. There'll be a link down below, and you can get a Fatty Joe Show t-shirt, water bottle, or mug, and that'll also help support us a little bit, and you can put the word out there. The other thing I want to ask is, if you go to the comments and the ratings, please leave a rating and review. That helps our information that we're presenting. The show is designed to help people find new avenues to health. So that'll help put us in front of more people. So please leave a comment and review down below. All right, everybody, have a great day. And remember, especially nowadays, please be kind to one another.
Thank you for joining us on the Fatty Joe Show. Be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. It helps the show reach more people. To support the show, as well as Carrie Brown and Yogi's work on the blog, keto recipe development, masterclasses, and to gain access to private Facebook groups and other awards, go to patreon.com/The Fatty Joe Show or patreon.com/Carrie Brown. Also, check out our Carrie Brown and Yogi Parker YouTube channel for video versions of the Fatty Joe Show, recipe videos, and more. Join our awesome community on the Facebook group, The Keto Kitchen with Carrie Brown and Yogi Parker, and check out our carriebrown.com website for recipes, blog posts, discounts, cookbooks, masterclasses, and other great stuff. Thank you so much.